So currently we have a problem in our cube in that balance sheet accounts are adding together and expenses are being added to revenue, and that's being shown incorrectly. Statistical accounts are all being summed together when they're completely independent, information purposes only kinds of accounts. So what we need to do is we need to configure the dimension to perform the aggregations correctly for the account dimension. First, what we need to do is to implement the Unary operator field, and this is something that has to be built into the data itself. And we can see if we browse the source table, we can see that this has been done already. By the use of an operator. So we have a tilde here, and a tilde means don't do anything with this value. And we have a plus sign that means add it to a previous member. There are cases where we're subtracting things. So for example, cost of sales will get subtracted from something. Let's look where we have our operating expenses, for example, would be subtracted from gross margin. And so we also have these tildes. The tilde operator says don't do any kind of aggregation, just leave this alone. Now when we're talking about aggregation, we're taking one member and adding or subtracting it from a sibling member if we're doing any addition or subtraction. And so it's all relative to members of the same level, that members that have the same parent. Do we add them together or not when we're rolling up values from children up to the parents? So we very easily add this to our dimension just by going to the accounts, the parent-child hierarchy, called accounts here, and we have a property that allows us to add in this Unary operator column. So here's the full name of the property here, Unary operator column. And we just open the box here and point to the column that contains that value. It does not need to be added as an individual attribute here. We just point to it in our property pane. Now, to make sure that the Unary operator works correctly, we might need to put the attribute members at the leaf level in the correct order. In this case, we can use the account. We want to make sure that we are sorting this properly. There's an order by property, and right now it is ordering by name. And what we might want to do is to instead order by the key value. So if we look at this, we can see that the account key is what's being used, and we could, if we wanted to, add in another attribute. So right now it's going to sort in account key order, and that may or may not match this account code that should be used. So rather than trust that the account key order here matches the same sequencing that we get for the original chart of account number, we can add in this account code alternate key. We'll just add it in and call this account number. And we can even hide this so that it's not available to our users. We can just say this is the property account hierarchy visible true. We can set that to false because we're just going to use this for sorting purposes. So we'll change the sorting. It's going to sort by the account code alternate key. Now this is set up as an integer value. If we look at the data type, it's going to be an integer. And because of the way that these accounts are set up, notice that we have like assets is it 10, and we have 110 and 1110. So in order to get a correct sequencing here, particularly when we have things that might be side by side, like a 60 next to 400 or something like that, we want to make sure that we get the sequencing that we expect. And in that case, we need those values to be looked at as strings. And so what I'm going to do is going to add account code alternate key again as the name column, but notice that it has a different data type. So when I do my sorting, of my accounts, I'm going to point to the name column of this account number attribute. So on the account, one of the things that's important is that we have a relationship between account and account number, and that should happen normally, but if something gets broken, that's going to be important to fix. But basically on the account itself now, I want to order by this attribute name. So the attribute would be the account number, and then it's going to use the name column of that account number. So as long as we have a relationship between account and account number, it allows me to use that attribute here in the order by attribute field, and then I use the order by property to indicate which column I want to use for sorting purposes. The key column, which would be integer based, or the name column, which would be string based. So then let's go ahead and deploy. We now have our unary operator in place, and we have our sort order correctly defined. And that's important so that the unary operator is performing in the correct sequence as it's comparing one child to another. So here we have the before image. So we've got, before I do the refresh here, for example, gross margin and operating expenses. Let's update this. And now we can see that assets and liabilities are not being added up. They just have a zero for the grand total. We have gross margin and operating expenses. In fact, those numbers are completely different than we saw before because, in turn, they have values that are being calculated. So, for example, net sales is being derived from a few things. So we have gross sales, and we have a value here, returns and adjustments and discounts, and that's actually reducing the overall net sales that we further reduce by subtracting the total cost of sales to come up with a gross margin. So these values were all being added together previously, which was incorrect. So our true gross margin is 1.18 million, and then we have all of these various expenses that do sum up, and we can see that the operating expenses is actually higher than our gross margin, so we have a negative operating profit here. So now what's happened is our statistical accounts went away, and that's because the grand total was not being calculated because each of those statistical accounts had a tilde operator on it. But we can see them here in our browser. If we just right click and select show empty cells, you can see that statistical accounts is empty here. But if we expand that, we can see that there are actually values as we go down and look at these things individually. So across the board, we can see that statistical account is still adding across time on some things, but not everything. For units, for example, we can see it's being added together, but for head count, it's not. And for square footage, it's not. It's using the last non-empty value. So now we have some correct behaviors here. The only other issue that we have is we've got this unknown member that doesn't probably need to be there. And we also have this grand total value that also does not need to be there.